Everyone, and welcome to the 69th, yes, the 69th edition of DF Direct Weekly. It is, as the name heavily implies, our weekly show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. A lot of topics to get through this week, and joining me, first of all, to discuss them, Tom Morgan.
Hello, back again after a little hiatus.
Fair enough, yes, nice to have you here. And back from vacation, Alex Battaglia.
Yep, I'm back a little bit tanned. Not really. You can only get so tan when you're this white. And really recharged to talk about all these great topics on the docket today.
Absolutely fantastic. So your energy bar has been fully replenished.
Yes.
If you were playing The Getaway on PlayStation 2, you would have leaned against a wall to recoup all of your energy. So let's go. Here's our first news topic for the week. Yesterday, at the time of filming, Guerrilla Games updated Horizon Forbidden West with a new 1.17 patch, which adds some rather nice features on top of the revised performance mode we saw in 1.16. So what we're seeing here is essentially two additions. Performance mode is enhanced with variable refresh rate support, and the quality mode has been augmented with a balanced alternative, which essentially delivers a locked 40 frames per second within a 120 hertz container. Tom, any notes on this before I talk about my impressions?
Only that it's just incredible that this is rolling out as a new trend. I believe Spider-Man had 120 hertz mode added in April, which gave people a similar sort of level of features, but this is really awesome to see. It's now been this is actually a thing in making use of VRR, and the fact the displays are now increasingly 120 hertz compatible. Like, that's just great.
Yeah, I think there is a caveat there, which is that if you've got an older HDMI 2.0 screen that does support 120 hertz, you're going to get busted down to 1080p with these modes.
Yeah, I'm in that boat for sure. Yeah.
So it's not recommended for play unless you really like 40 hertz if you've got an older display. Alex, thoughts on this one?
I mean, I think it's great that they're rolling this out because the post-launch support for this game has been incredible. I think John's video covering the TAA differences in that performance mode really just showed that Guerrilla was going to take the time to do the legwork to make the experience better. I mean, obviously, it would be awesome if these things were there at launch, but things like VRR didn't exist at launch. And, you know, the development time is limited in this COVID era. The one thing that I'm really curious about is essentially from you, Rich, is like the performance of that VRR mode, because, you know, we have a couple VRR modes in other games. Some of them hug to like 90 and 120 FPS, while others are just kind of like slightly above.
Yeah.
You know, what is it like?
Good question. I did actually play the patch yesterday, and yeah, first impressions, you know, it's really good to actually have these additional options, but you do need that HDMI 2.1 screen. But let's go through exactly what the modes are doing. Let's start with the performance mode, I guess. It is essentially, I believe, the existing performance mode with an unlocked frame rate. So what that essentially means is that any potential dips below 60 frames per second, which were few and far between as they should be ironed out. But more to the point, frame rate above 60 FPS. This has now been unlocked, so it runs, you know, essentially as fast as it will go. What I noted was that in the sort of heavy forest-like areas, you're still in sort of 60 to 70 frames per second territory, depending on context. But, you know, you can see that it's unlocked because if you look into the sky, suddenly you're up to like 80, 90 frames per second, but it doesn't really move beyond that. So I consider the VRR mode there to be additive, interesting, but not exactly essential. I did actually note that frame rate at one point dipped below 60, which, you know, it was like 58, which is essentially an irrelevance in the VRR realm because the difference in frame times is so minute. But this might hint that the dynamic resolution scaling window has been basically tightened. So it aims to preserve image quality, knowing it can fall back on VRR in order to maintain smooth performance. So in theory, the performance mode not only could provide a frame rate enhancement above 60, but I actually found that quite hard to feel. But at the same time, it could also introduce an image quality advantage in that possibly the dynamic resolution scaling isn't quite as wide. So yeah, I don't consider that mode a game changer, but what I did find fascinating was the new balanced mode, which is exactly as we've seen with the implementations in Ratchet and Clank and the Spider-Man titles, which is to say that 40 hertz divides evenly into 120 hertz, so it uses the 120 hertz mode of your screen, and yeah, a new frame every third refresh. Totally consistent, looks beautiful, clearly a higher resolution versus the performance mode. So I'm actually in two minds as to which one I'd like to play the game with, because the performance mode, 60 frames per second plus, looks really, really nice. But the quality mode, you do get that extra little bit of clarity, and you do get that perfect consistency at 40 hertz. And something which, I guess, which kind of amused me is when we did the Ratchet and Clank 40 FPS video, the response was basically to ignore the content from some people and just basically say, it's only 10 frames per second more than 30. What's the point? But the point is that there's no linear relationship between frame rate and frame time. The frame time is dead center between 30 and 60. So if you don't really understand the relationship, it's kind of like a 45 FPS mode, if you like.
That's so good.
But that's the way it works, and I just can't choose between the two, because you are essentially getting two very smooth presentations, one smoother than the other, but slightly less clear. And the balance mode at 40 FPS looks really, really good, and it is consistent. Where would you go, Alex, notionally?
I think I would actually probably do the VRR performance mode, just because VRR would make it so that those occasional dips that performance mode could have would be much smoothened over usually, unless they have like really high frame times or something like that. And there is an added benefit in those rarer instances of it being in like 60 to 70 range, because honestly, I can see the difference between like basically right until you get about to like 100 FPS, you do see it with every like 10 to 15 FPS. You do see some nice additive benefits there in terms of like how framey the presentation looks with like large arc movements. So I would probably end up using that as well. And based upon John's video covering the image quality in that mode, I found it rather reasonable. Like, yes, it was obviously not as pristine as the native 4K presentation in that 30 FPS mode, but I thought it was the smoothness is just way more important to me.
It's difficult for me to choose between them, but another thought that did spring to mind is there would likely be measurable input lag advantages to running in the performance mode, which kind of subtle when you're dealing with a joypad. It's not really that sort of relationship with low input lag that you'd get with like a mouse or keyboard. But at the same time, I could see that as being a big advantage. But yeah, generally, what could I say? I mean, I thought the game launched beautifully. Obviously, there were a few bugs which they did address. The big issue, obviously, was the image quality in with their chosen TAA solution. And I think the solution that they've come up with for it was the patch 1.14, 1.16, actually is a big boost to the game, and it brought the performance mode into contention. And it also means that the 40 hertz and the 60 and the performance modes now are embellished significantly as well. So overall, I think this patch is well worth checking out. The game is in better shape than it's ever been before, and there's going to be a lot of new PlayStation 5 owners experiencing this title because it's a packing game with the console now. And so hats off to Gorilla. Kind of interested where they go next. I guess the next thing they are going to be doing is going to be the PlayStation VR Horizon Call of the Mountain. And I'd be interested to see how that all stacks up. But yeah, that's the patch. Any final impressions, Tom?
Only that if I was to choose between the modes, I'd probably stick with the full 4K rendition of it. Like the OLED B8, LG B8 I've got. There's no VRR support. There's no 120 hertz at 4K support. No HDMI 2.1. So it's kind of like I can access some of the more fluid frame rates of that new performance mode, but I don't know. It feels like such a showpiece game for the PlayStation 5 that I'd want to, enjoy that without compromising the fluidity without VRR as well. I don't know if I'd really
Hmm.
want to run it without that. So yeah, it's kind of forced my hand on that, but
I'll give it a go.
uh,
I think the performance mode is where I'd land on one of those older displays because they did mitigate the image quality issues that mode had with the new TAA, and you're at 60 and it looks and plays great. It's a massive improvement from the launch code. But yeah, interesting stuff there, and I really like this 40 hertz support and the VRR support that Sony are baking into their titles now, and hopefully we'll get something impressive with God of War, which is I think it's just been announced that it's actually going to be coming this year, 2022, and yeah, we can't wait to take a look at that. But more on that soon, I guess. Hopefully there'll be a full marketing cycle. But let's move on to the next topic. Wasn't entirely sure whether we should cover this one because it just seemed to be a news story that was speculative. There were a lot of sources coming up with it, but essentially there's reports emerging that Rockstar, and we've got more of that about them in our next news story, have canned potential remasters for Red Dead Redemption, the original one, and GTA 4. Tom, what do you make of this?
well, in the first instance, it is a shame because those games do need, well, not so much for Red Dead. I mean, Red Dead more so overall, but it's kind of like we have these games have needed a little bit of an update in the similar vein as like The Last of Us has had several like updates now, and it feels like they're leaning on the fact, it appears, that the GTA trilogy just didn't land as well as it should have. And we covered this extensively with comparisons to the PS2 version, where they stripped out so much of the identity of those games, the atmosphere, the color grading, and just didn't go far enough with the updates to like the character models and the way they performed, the motion capture on those. So that trilogy was in an awkward spot where it wasn't far enough to justify existing, and they made some artistic errors in terms of like the tone and everything. That the whole aesthetic was ruined if you're going in for a nostalgia trip on those. So it feels like they should definitely do these remasters or even remakes if we want to go that far, but do it the right way, because that was the problem. It wasn't fundamentally approached with the right mindset, and the results spoke for itself. And Oliver's most recent YouTube analysis, it was kind of looking at the more recent updates of it, still haven't solved all the issues. There's still grass hovering over the ground. There's still plants sticking out of the road. It just looks like it's not good. If they really care, I would be all up for it, but that just shows they didn't care enough to push the bar of quality high. So yeah, I mean, I'd love to see Red Dead Redemption, the original. We've got a nice way to play it on back compat on Xbox One X and Series X, of course. I believe those are 4K now,
Hmm.
Yeah.
natively. And yeah, so that's fantastic, and it's a good way to do it. But there's clearly scope to go even further and do a lot more with those games, and especially in light of Red Dead 2, which looks incredible. They could bring it up to par with the visual quality on that. But I don't know what you guys reckon.
Alex, where do you land on this? Because as a PC guy, I mean, there's no Red Dead on PC.
Yeah.
GTA 4, I don't know what you make of the quality of that port, but it was certainly
It's
very different to the console versions. So,
yeah. I'm
how does this news arrive in Shea Battaglia?
Here in the chateau, we like good PC ports. GTA4 actually back in the day, I have like a split mind on it. It did scale quite a bit higher than those console versions, which was really interesting at the time. But it also has just like it's like really finicky. Like I've ran it on new PCs where it has trouble getting above like 20 FPS for some reason, and I just don't know why. I've also ran it at times where it's like skyrocketing performance. So it is obviously has some compatibility issues apparently with newer hardware and or newer Windows revisions, maybe.
Right.
So that's an issue that I would have loved to have seen tackled, perhaps via a patch. I don't know if it really needs a remaster, because the game itself is like, these games are huge. Like remastering them is a really big effort. They're big open worlds, and then like redoing, if you want to make them remastered in the remake kind of sense, that means like we're doing all these assets, and you're basically making a whole new game at that point. With like the modern asset pipelines, that's what the game is. It's like all these assets. So I feel like GTA 4 is in this area where I don't think it would really be worth it, but Red Dead Redemption, I would just, as a remaster of that, would just be making it like really x86 compatible and just throwing out an exe for PC. And it could be literally the exact same looking game, just with high resolution shadows and, like high resolution support, arbitrary frame rate support, and call it a day. I would actually really like that. But this feels like an overreaction to me if it is actually the truth, because as Tom said, the issue with those GTA 3 definitive remastered editions, whatever they're called, was the quality of the porting effort and the attention to detail for all these things, which was lacking. And it wasn't the idea itself, which makes me think the fact that they canceled this is maybe because these projects had a similar quality trajectory already or something like that, and they were like, oh gosh, we can't bring that out again, because like let's not forget, this is a company, they just love money. So so that's why they would maybe not bring it out. I don't think it's like a knee-jerk reaction to the very idea of this, but maybe to actually what they had in the pipeline.
Well, from my perspective, the GTA Definitive Edition was essentially fundamentally flawed on the first principles, which is to say, okay, we're going to take these mobile ports of these games that we did and put them in Unreal Engine 4.
Weird. So weird.
Which is like, two no-nos straight from the off. And then, the execution was flawed in that, it was, okay, let's AI upscale a bunch of assets. Let's smooth off geometry. Let's not really pay attention to the animation. Let's dip into Unreal Engine 4's toolbox in a really cack-handed, haphazard way and get it all wrong. So that is certainly, if that was the trajectory of these two proposed remasters, then holy crap, no. I think the bottom line is that, all that's really needed is, as you say, Alex, an x86 port of Red Dead Redemption, okay, a decent PlayStation port. It doesn't need to rewrite the rule book, because we've seen from the back compat version on Xbox Series X and Series and the Series console, Series S will be 1440p. That looks fine. Just basically produce a version of the game that will run on today's hardware and the hardware of tomorrow. That's kind of it. Just preserve them. Don't try to enhance them in ways that as you say, the only real route forward is to go for a full remake, right? To bring those older games up to par with like GTA 5 and Red Dead 2, preferably Red Dead 2. But, that would be a gigantic difference in resource allocation compared to doing a remaster. So on the one hand, I'm kind of happy that they're potentially not happening, assuming the stories are true. But on the other hand, I do think that those games deserve better preservation and just sort of moved into the modern era, so they work on today's machines and will work on future machines. Because, if you do that work in the here and now, then, the way the consoles are going, everything will be backwards compatibility moving forward. So, your games will continue to sell on future platforms as well as the current one. And of course, getting everything sorted on PC is, just good practice, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But, I guess we'll have to see whether anything happens on that. But in the meantime, Red Dead Redemption, obviously, yes, I think we've mentioned that a couple of times. Xbox One X, Xbox Series consoles, it's really good. Best way to play. But let's move on to the next topic. So this topic is related to the previous one in that Take-Two Interactive have legally taken action. They've sent a letter to Luke Ross, who's responsible for these real VR mods. So, basically what he does is put a lot of time and effort into reverse engineering a game, adding virtual reality support that's really strong, that's really robust, that works, that's tested, and is essentially taking old games and refreshing them for the VR audience. And the response from Take-Two has essentially been to issue Luke Ross with a DMCA takedown notice. This is old ground, right, Alex? Because we had the same issues with Take-Two basically instigating legal action against modders of the first GTA titles.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, which was because of their own work on these definitive edition, quote unquote, remasters. What do you think's going on here?
I think just Take-Two is one of those really overzealous and overly protective of their IP to the point of damaging communities kind of companies, where they're large enough, they make so much money off of GTA 5 online, just like prints money for them that they, and like GTA, and you reread that the remaster of GTA 5 like put it back in like the top 10 charts for a while. That thing's just printing money again. It's a machine that they don't really actually have to care about, like fostering community in the traditional sense, like the way you would do it like in the early 2000s or late 90s, where it was like dedicated communities working on games alongside as like modders. Very different times now. And the company is not the one that it was when it was DMA and whatever, like Rockstar, that is. So, they don't really have to care about these things. And this is just another, stroke of that, just another thing. And it doesn't do anything. It doesn't do anything positive in the world. Like, I find this detestable. This is just enriching the experience of these games for people who do it for free of charge. And, I don't understand it. I really don't get, like, this is not a threat to anything that Take-Two is doing at all. So I think it's just kind of like, they're a big company. They don't actually have to care, but it's actually just really embarrassing from like my perspective. Like, these are small, small producers here. They don't require legal threats. And I'm pretty sure, I'm not a legal expert, but I'm pretty sure that the ability to mod games is well allowed within a lot of legal frameworks the world over. It's why you can do it since the dawn of time. It's just a matter of how you monetize it or don't monetize it. I think that's usually the big deal. So I don't know. I really wish they didn't do it, but this is just Take-Two. This is what they do.
Any thoughts to add to that, Tom?
Yeah, there's certainly no Valve, are they? Take-Two. They just and I again, like as you say, Alex, I couldn't begin to predict what the conversation was like in the Take-Two boardroom when they, decided now's the moment to strike and issue a DMCA takedown. But the optimist in me says it's because they have their own plans to do VR or something, and they didn't want to have any sort of feature overlap with a mod that may not be up to par with their standard. That's a very optimistic outlook. Maybe, I don't know. It seems very odd. And reading the post, Luke Ross's post on his Patreon, he's very gracious about the whole thing, and he's saying, he's not sure where this is coming from and what grounds they are pursuing him on exactly. And that obviously, to use the mod, you need to have bought the game, which is definitely true. You need to have bought the game, and it appears that his code is just layering on top of what they produced to allow you to enjoy it in a different way. So it seems like a classic mod situation. I don't understand where the problem is, but maybe we don't know everything. Yeah. What do you reckon, Rich?
Well, we've got a question here from supporter Exis. Hey DF, some sad news that this week we have another mod developer receiving a DMC takedown from Rockstar / Take-Two, this time the developer of the excellent VR mods for GTA, RDR2, and Mafia. Curious what the team thinks about this. Perhaps one might argue there's money being made off their IP, but on the other hand, since users still need to own the respective games, there's no loss of sales to speak of. Could we reasonably hope to have a change of heart in the Goliaths of the industry towards a more open approach like Valve? I really hate this. This is not good at all. Because fundamentally, this guy is not subtracting value from anything Take-Two is doing, nor is it causing any loss of revenues, certainly at this time, because there's no alternative. In fact, to play these mods, you need the game, which means you need to buy it, which means that Take-Two make money potentially from enhancements to their existing game. Perhaps, I mean, there's two sort of things that are potentially problematic here, which is the nature of the Patreon itself, which, as Exis points out, although the mod is free, that if you are a Patreon supporter of Luke Ross, then essentially Luke Ross is benefiting financially from a Take-Two IP. That is a potential argument. The other potential argument is that all of these end user agreements that games come with typically have a clause in there which is essentially saying, if you use this game, don't reverse engineer it. But I still don't know whether end user agreements have actually been legally tested and as to how legally viable they are. But certainly, I'm not sure whether a DMCA takedown is probably the right route, because it suggests a copyright infringement when, as according to Luke Ross, his mods are not actually replicating any code, and they are a separate layer that sort of sits within the code. You add it to the game. He's not distributing copyrighted materials. So in that sense, I mean, I'm no lawyer, but it certainly seems to be the case that, this is another attack by Take-Two against the concept of modding, as opposed to having any sort of grounding in,
Rich,
in law.
Rich, you know about cars. Is there any sort of similar thing in cars at all? I'm just trying to think that this feels so video game industry BS to me. Just like stuff that the video game industry does. There's no legal standing.
Yeah.
Like if you modify your Ford Focus with aftermarket anything, will they Ford will issue DMCA takedowns on air freshener manufacturers or something like that? It seems so stupid. What is this?
I do like the way that in terms of potential modifications to a vehicle, you've come up with some sort of air conditioning mod. Is that right?
I don't know anything about cars.
Well, the sort of mods you get on cars, which may be applicable to this, is they have enhancements to the computer that sort of works with the engine, the ECU they call it, and you can basically get extra horsepower for your car by flashing a new firmware onto the computer.
Cool.
There.
That is very cool.
There's also stuff which is potentially a bit more problematic, like for example my old BMW. For some bizarre reason, BMW would not allow me to use Apple CarPlay with it, but it was within the computer. They wouldn't sell the upgrade to me, but they would to other users. But I could go to eBay, pay £30, and some bloke in Romania would give me the files to flash the car computer. That's potentially, I mean, they don't take any action against it because fundamentally what happens is if it all goes horribly wrong, then it's down on the user. Yeah. And it's small beer for them. They can't police the individual user. Other mods, stuff like body kits and whatnot, there's, this is the other thing, right? Do you own the game if you own the game, then potentially you should have the right to mod it, right? This is the
Yeah.
other thing which has been kind of changing over the years, which is the concept of ownership. If I buy a game, why shouldn't I mod it? That is the question, right? But increasingly, end user agreements and DRM are stopping that from happening, which isn't great. All I can say really is best of luck to Luke Ross. He's asked. I mean, I don't think the mods are actually down at the moment. He's seeking clarification from Rockstar on what he's actually done wrong, quite rightly.
So now's the time to strike if you want to download it. Give it a go. It looks awesome, by the way. I had a look at some YouTube videos of it in action, and it's maybe if you apt to a bit of motion sickness, then steer clear, because there's some very heavy animations on like the rolls when you get knocked over. But it looks really cool. I was enjoying watching the video.
The thing is, right, what's happening here is that Luke Ross has actually identified something with these games that would actually make them exceptionally cool. Rather than Take-Two shutting it down, they should be working with Luke Ross to actually integrate it into the actual product, right?
And to make more money.
Yes,
right? They love money. Come on.
It's just really heavy-handed, and I just don't really get it. Unfortunately, I do get it, but it's just not great practice. But, this is what happens. Sometimes legal action can be instigated even when there is no case, because, if it's just Luke Ross sitting there without, the financial resources of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, then, the best route forward for him personally is likely just to shut it down and move on, which is sort of not
in
great.
Previous cases where this has happened, DMCA takedowns of, say, fan remake projects. There was one ages ago on Chrono Trigger and all sorts. The case is that it's usually to avoid it being the thin end of a wedge in terms of what users can do with an IP.
Well, yeah, but
here it feels like
the thing with these remakes that you're talking about there is that they are essentially remaking a game, right? And there is some sort of ownership of IP there, which I do think would fall within the purview of copyright.
Yes, that's true.
But with the mods, as they've been described here by Luke Ross, it is essentially an adjustment to the existing code that you need to buy from Take-Two in order to play the games. So, I don't know. It's just not great at all. So let's move on to the next topic. So recently, Alex produced a video on the new patches for Resident Evil. And there was the sense really that on the PC side, at least, Capcom doesn't really have its eye on the ball. The quality of their PC work, the foundations seem to be there, but the execution is lackluster, if not outright poor. And this week, we saw the arrival of DLSS support for Monster Hunter on PC. And it looks like a continuation of this problem, right, Alex?
Yeah, so let's talk about Monster Hunter.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Is like this game is very low spec. Like, you don't really require a big
support
GPU.
It's a Switch game originally, right?
It's a Switch game.
It is, yeah.
It's a Switch game. So it's got like mobile graphics. Tom covered it. It runs really, really well at really high resolutions on just, pretty okay graphics hardware. So adding DLSS, while nice, is a bit,
it's not a game changer,
really
is what you're saying.
It's nothing. Yeah, it's really, maybe it's because they added it to the engine. Let's just hope that's because they added it to the engine, and it signals the fact that we'll see DLSS in future Capcom titles. I'm hoping it means that. But here, in this case, following the line of whatever they've been doing for a while now with their PC ports, it just lacks the polish that it should really have. And the reason for that is because in Monster Hunter, you always have like these, the game always has like animal characters that have like a lot of fur on them. And in this game specifically, there's like companions that you can have and things like that as well too. And these companions are rendered with a style of fur rendering that for some reason, and I'm not sure what this is, I don't know the technical reason for it, but the game's TAA doesn't work. I've covered that. But like when you turn on the TAA, it enables the fur rendering as well. Otherwise, they just don't have any fur, which is really, really weird looking. In this case, when you turn on DLSS, whatever it does is not doing whatever the base TAA does. So all the animals in the game with this fur rendering just don't have any fur. And it's like one of the most basic things you see in the first menu of the game is literally one of these animals. It's like the second thing you see after the main menu. So why is this in there? This is it's not even oversight. It's so blatant that I just don't think they have people testing these games. Obviously, I don't want to knock on QA departments for being lackluster or something like that. But whatever the producers are doing and saying that's good enough to ship, that's the part of the pipeline that is obviously so broken at Capcom regarding PC. Like shipping games without working TAA, shipping menus that are made by bizarro aliens. Monster Hunter's menus are hilarious with how useless they are, and the fact that you can't edit the game's graphical options until you've completed the tutorial. Who made this? I don't even know. I don't know what's going on there, but they really need to shape up their ship. I don't know these phrases. Either ways, they need to get something better than whatever they're doing right now. And this is just once again, another issue of them not ensuring the quality of a release for some reason.
Yeah, they just I totally agree. DLSS is not a necessary addition necessarily for this game. Maybe if you're on, it's nice to have if you're on a very low-end graphics card and you just need a bit of a performance boost. But one of the big benefits for DLSS for me was always accessing more graphical features and extras that you wouldn't be able to by using DLSS, engaging that to its clawback performance. And here we're losing features that are just readily apparent from the get-go. So yeah, that's really bad. But I like them, again, optimist in me says, oh, maybe they're using it here as a bit of a test run for future games. It's in the engine now. So yeah, that is a plus, even if it doesn't work properly.
What? If it doesn't work, it shouldn't be in the game.
Well, yeah. DLSS works. DLSS works.
Okay,
itself,
it works.
Right?
It works in the same way that the game would work if the TAA is disabled, right, Alex?
Yeah.
To be fair, there is some sort of semblance of fur in the underlying textures underneath, but it's flat. It's not proper fur rendering. But I'm just trying to get my head around the concept that there was a discussion at the developer that said, right, okay, let's put DLSS support in there. And did nobody, put their hand up and say, whoa, hold on a minute. If this replaces TAA, which, is a function of DLSS, all the fur rendering is going to go away. And, it was like, okay, well, let's just do it anyway. That doesn't... What was the conversation that led to this? I don't get it. There's a lot of sort of bizarre things that happen in games development, but this is so sort of blatant. The other thing, of course, is that it is so blatant that the headlines just write themselves, right? I first saw it on Rock Paper Shotgun, I think, and it was like, holy crap, what's going on here? And it's one of these situations where you have to click on the headline to read it because you don't believe it. And then you see the pictorial evidence, and there it is. So I think this is, again, we've been talking about this for a while now, but there does seem to be something up with Capcom and their PC ports that needs to be addressed. And it is, as I said, the fundamentals are there, right? The framework engine is really good.
We love RE.
Yeah,
it's great.
It works really well. The performance is good. It just seems to be the basic technical polish that is lacking. And this is another example of this. So, Alex, I was just thinking about this. On your Resident Evil video, you basically said that TAA doesn't work in Monster Hunter, and it doesn't, right? Because it's a jaggy fest. But maybe the option should have just been fur rendering on-off then, based on what you're saying.
And that's what it should have said. God, yeah. I don't know. I just don't. I really wish I knew what the thought process was there, because, like you said, Rich, the person who was implementing this had to have some idea of what rendering is. and they were looking at the game like this was like obvious. I don't know.
Well, it sort of goes back for me personally to the Resident Evil Village DRM debacle, where all of these stutters that happened within the game were essentially a combination of two DRM systems that were entirely not needed, at least Capcom's own internal DRM, which was layered with de novo, which caused these issues, which were solved by a mod, aka a crack, which kind of shamed Capcom into sorting it out. But even in that scenario, I don't understand how that game shipped with those stutters without somebody within the developer saying, hold on a minute, this shouldn't be happening. And now we're seeing it again with Monster Hunter coming out with, okay, we're going to put in this marquee feature, which is, beloved by many in the PC community, but hold on a minute, the fur rendering disappears. Oh, well, let's ship it anyway. That's surely, in both cases, it's like, surely somebody would have noticed. And if they did, why did it ship anyway? I guess that's just my thought on it. It's just bizarre, right? Okay, let's move on. Next topic. This one's more of a public service announcement, but next week, Halo Infinite is receiving a new flighting program where 343 Industries are going to be testing out campaign co-op. We're going to be looking at it. Tom, looking forward to this one?
Yeah, definitely. It was meant to be, you could tell the design of the game was meant to factor in co-op from the start. Like, these levels were pretty big, and it felt like there were clear points where this was meant to be like spawning out to 2 or even up to 4 players in co-op. So a weird omission at launch last year, and good to see it finally working its way in, and that we can we're all signed up for the beta. It involves a bit of a sign-up process, but once you're enrolled, we should be able to get a good test.
Alex, thoughts? I mean, I guess the good thing about this is that conceivably we can actually run a co-op session across multiple platforms simultaneously, which I always love doing. What are you looking out for with this? I guess from my perspective, obviously there is the concept of performance, but I don't expect it to change that much from the single player co-op. Potentially a CPU increase. But what are you looking for? I mean, from my perspective, I think it's the gameplay mechanics, how it's actually going to work.
Yes, that's like, because we've seen larger world games with co-op have pretty severe limitations about like how far you can get away from one another. I guess another part of this is currently, I think it's all about co-op via online and or LAN play, but split screen has got to get in there at some time.
I think there was some leaked shots back in the day. I don't know whether they were faked or not or whatever, but
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean,
that'd be something I'd be really interested in. But one other thing I'm also interested in around this like cross-platform idea is like you have like your 30 hertz Xbox One S, whatever, and then you have like 120 hertz Series X maybe. And I'm curious if like I've seen it before in the Gears of War titles where the character, for example, that is sending its network packet stuff in co-op moves at 30 FPS while the other characters don't.
Oh no!
I've seen that. I've seen that before with Gears of War 4, actually, where I played with my brother who was on Xbox One at the time, and I was on PC, and that was pretty interesting to see. I'm curious if it will have the same limitation here, or whether they'll do some nice interpolation of those animations. But they're pretty bad at this animation interpolation thing, so I'm not sure.
You'd think that whatever they're using in multiplayer.
This is true.
Would port across to that, and it seemed to be okay there. I don't think there was any sort of
I don't believe
incriminating evidence that that would indicate that the player in front of me is running on an Xbox One. But I think Oliver is actually going to be testing this on an old Durango Xbox One for the ultimate stress test, which I think should be quite interesting. But yeah, we will be looking at that one next week. But yes, I think it's the case that if you own the game, if you're on Games Pass, Alex, Uh, you should be able to opt into the Xbox Insider program, and essentially you should be able to download an Insider build, which is all good stuff. So yes, we will be covering that next week. Let's move on to our final news topic. Guys, it's happening. Biomutant. Finally, it has been announced that it is being enhanced for the latest generation of consoles, Xbox Series machines and PlayStation 5. I'm sure you're excessively excited about this, Tom. The concept that there's going to be 3 graphics modes, quality unleashed. I love that. Is that official?
Yeah.
40 plus FPS, 40 plus FPS up to 4K.
What is that even about? I guess I don't know.
VRR mode, isn't it? Basically,
well,
I guess
40
so.
to 60.
40, yeah, I think that's possibly what's going on there, and I think possibly Unleashed should actually be unlocked. If it is just the quality mode running unlocked without a frame rate cap, that could kind of make sense, right?
Yeah,
that would make sense. Yeah,
and performance mode 60 frames per second at 1440p. Series consoles are getting the same modes. But obviously there's going to be 1440p for quality mode on Series S. So yes, the requisite lowering of resolution for the less capable junior Xbox. And I guess, well, what can I say? I don't know whether we're going to be looking at it. We didn't look at the last one until we did the April Fool, but I guess we could take a look at it, see what's going on there. But, you know, it's happening. It's going to be a free upgrade.
Maybe we owe it to them just because, I mean, we weren't taking a piss with the game itself there. The game is
a piss with the game.
I don't know. We were, you know, we weren't making fun of the game. Biomutant is a quality title for those who enjoy those kind of games. It was more like the joke of the fact that people in the audience just like ask us these kind of questions. Like,
yeah, it was essentially, when are we going to be covering Biomutant? And also it was a send up of our own analysis techniques.
Yeah, exactly. Like the time when Audie just like chimes in, I think we need 5,000 times Zoom.
Yep.
That always makes me tear up. It's
and the dynamic frame rate, of course,
yeah,
which actually sounds suspiciously like Quality Unleashed.
Yeah, dynamic frame rate time. I guess to be serious about this for a split second, I am a little bit curious about Quality Unleashed as like the ability to benchmark. If it's the same between PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, it could be an interesting title to benchmark against each other and maybe PC components. That's
true. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. But you know, it's not as if people don't know now. Biomutant
we
is
all know
coming.
what they're like.
Fully official Xbox Series and PlayStation 5 patches. So look forward to that. And that's it. That's the end of our news discussion for the week. And before we move on to supporter Q&A, Alex, we're going to be talking about FSR 2.0 because, well, in the wake, I think, of a couple of really good videos that you produced, AMD got in touch with us and essentially said, hey, why don't you talk to us about FSR 2.0? That content is going to be running, I think, next week, possibly towards the end of that week. I guess I'm asking you for some spoilers. What happened in this interview?
So I talked with, oh my gosh, I keep pronouncing his name wrong. It's a French last name, Nick Tiberus. My brain is.
Alex, this is
I
embarrassing.
need to eat some breakfast. That's what my problem is right now. I'm sorry, Nick. I pronounced your name wrong again. But I talked with them, and they're the head of the FSR 2.0 program. They're also like head of like the game engineering department there at AMD, where they interact with developers to add specific features into the game, like through the game's the Open GPU project and all these things, as well as just helping them optimize their game to run well on AMD hardware. And we talked about essentially to give a little bit of spoiler, we talked about like the ideas behind FSR 2.0, what it does specifically to combat issues that we often see in TAA, and as well as the future of FSR, because FSR 2.0 is one in a generation of iterative releases that we'll be seeing going forward. So we talk about what that future might look like. So if you're interested in the future of FSR and how it currently works right now, that's what that interview is going to be all about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting stuff. And they also talked about the Xbox Series implementation, right?
Yeah. Kind of giving a hint at like what it means to bring FSR 2.0 to consoles, like what limitations they had to watch out for, as well as, like what kind of optimizations are specific to the Xbox Series with FSR 2.0.
Okay, so yeah, look forward to that content. It's going to be really, really interesting. And just generally, I'm just really happy with the way we're handling image reconstruction coverage on the channel because man, we've had a lot of discussions internally and externally about how we're actually going to be doing this and how we can actually produce meaningful image quality comparisons. Yeah, and it's tricky, right?
It still is tricky. I don't want to toot my own horn, but like that video work is hard as balls. It is so hard to get it done. Like there are so many recordings to be made, making sure that they line up. Oh my God, there's like hundreds of recordings when I finish this, and then editing it, scripting it. I have no idea how I actually do it in the time allotted. Sometimes it seems insane, and it's still imperfect. Like I think we saw that rather recently online, where people were asking me to like look at it on an AMD card. We've heard from AMD themselves that's like it's going to be like we're not expecting visual differences here, people, between GPUs. And as you can see, like I produced like a little image on Twitter there, that like even there we're seeing differences between images because games are really dynamic. Like the lighting conditions between, if you don't do it on the perfect frame and stuff like that, like just lining up, even that stuff is imperfect. Even my lineups are imperfect, and I try and do it as perfect as possible. So like there is probably a really good way of doing these image comparisons that involves automation to a certain degree, but it like completely blows up the time schedule for producing videos in a viable way. Like I don't know how to do it, but I hope everyone in the audience is happy as we are with our like current way we're doing image quality testing.
I don't think you can programmatically analyze the quality.
Maybe.
Well, how? I mean, I think from it is essentially we're looking for discontinuities, artifacts that I think it would be exceptionally tricky for anything other than the most advanced AI to be looking at, and that AI wouldn't really know where to start looking for that stuff without actual integration into the game. I was kind of sort of intrigued by this concept that that FSR 2.0 could manifest differently on different architectures because it's compute, right?
Yeah, it's like mostly like
it's
compute
math.
FP32,
Maths,
a lot of it. Yeah.
If basically two GPUs should be processing maths in the same way, right?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, there's been technical inconsistencies in the past between like CPUs, for example, in terms of how FP32 is done. I know that for a fact. But like here, like the things that would be really different that you would actually capture between frames is the fact that you're dealing with like, for example, in that image that I posted, like I started that, like the reason why you might see differences that don't have to do with like, oh my God, AMD or NVIDIA GPUs process this differently, is the fact that like I started the frame of animation X amount of frames after a cutscene ended. And I can't do that exact every single time. It's virtually impossible for a human to do. So like lighting conditions change, the position of Kratos changes, all these things. It's just like, I can like line up things to with like, I would say within like 95%, but then there's just like random conditions I just can never control for. It's impossible. So whenever you see one of my nice little FSR videos, I should probably maybe add a little asterisk in there that says like 90% accurate, 95% accurate, so people don't hunt me down on Twitter telling me that I'm doing my work wrong. But yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, just leave the hunting down to me. I've got
that's
that covered, don't worry. Okay, let's move on to our final part of the show. So this is Supporter Q&A. This is where backers of the Digital Foundry Supporter Program issue forth questions on a weekly basis for us to answer. We get a huge amount of questions. We can't answer them all, but we choose the ones which strike us as being insightful and or amusing. And we're going to be starting with this one from Stuart Hart. Hi DF crew, you love high frame rates. I love high frame rates. but why am I seeing this trend from certain games / devs to cull animation interpolation on quote unquote distant, read not very far away characters? Alex pointed this out in the recent RE2 remake RT video, but didn't make much noise about it. I thought you did. Why do we never see animation LOD parameters in graphical options? Would it bring consoles / PCs to their knees? So, Alex, is this like basically a hangover from the fact that the older consoles were using really crap CPUs, essentially?
Yeah, I think it is. For example, in RE2, it was just really blatant. I think it was probably a bit too much there, even for those last gen machines, because they ran originally like unlocked, right? And they were like usually above 30.
They're running up to 60.
Yeah, so it felt like a little bit too much even there. I wouldn't use that as the classic example, but like one of the more classic examples I can think of is from Hitman 2 and 3, I guess Hitman 1, but with Hitman 2, originally this was not really tweakable, but then they added in a CPU simulation quality option, which controlled the kind of AI update at a distance usually. And that is where on PC you could actually take it further. And you do see this in those games, but in other games, for example, I think it looks really bad in all of the Dark Souls, Bloodborne, etc. games where they do the same thing. But there's no tweakability of that, unfortunately. And there's like usually really vast distances between enemies when you're just looking at them. So it is a shame, and I really don't know why they don't add it in, because they obviously have the tweakable parameter to do it. It's not like the code does that initially. It's like they have to add in that optimization for it to work. So it's just a matter of developers in this case not prioritizing adding that option in, unfortunately.
Right, because a lot of games do it. Destiny used to do it, or still might do it, as far as I'm aware. But it is quite done well. It kind of works, right? If it is indeed an NPC or an enemy character that is far in the distance, then it does sort of, you can sort of miss it in the run of play. But I think it's one of these situations where it should be the case that it is configurable, as it was made in Hitman. That was actually one of your critiques at launch, wasn't it?
It was originally, and they did add it in. That was really cool. I don't know, it probably has nothing to do with me, but that was really cool to see. A game where I thought, for example, we're talking about where it's been done well. I don't think the Dark Souls games do it well.
Oh no way.
And but I also don't think it was, it was, for the time, for what they were trying to do, it made sense, but it was just really unfortunate was how it was done in Halo 5 as well, where like Halo 5 had like a really slick 60 FPS update, but like the animations really degraded really close to the camera, and it took away from the fluidity of the visuals. The controls were still snappy, but didn't look too good. That was unfortunate. Yeah.
I think they're with Halo, especially because you're usually interacting with enemies that far away.
Yes,
that makes a big difference as compared to something like Elden Ring, where they update like a quarter, like enemies a quarter of the like intended rate, and yet you're not really going to be interacting with them. I mean, maybe the crossbow or something like that, but typically you're more melee based in that. Elden Ring was really, really bad, and I think it says a lot that this type of optimization, this tweakable, this LOD parameter is really designed for CPU limited systems, because we saw it on Xbox One most glaringly. It was just awful in Elden Ring. And even like Capcom has previous history with this sort of approach. They had my earliest memory of this being used, like a half frame rate AI in the background, was Street Fighter 4 on 3DS, and a couple couple of their fighters, like the Vita port of Street Fighter X Tekken as well, CPU limited systems again, where they needed to claw back just small gains, it seems. And but I guess for the PC side, and why it's not so often added, is it's just again maybe very minor gains for a system which typically has enough CPU power to plow through and give you that performance.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
should definitely be there, and it does make a difference to the impact of the performance in Hitman. You know, it depends, I guess, on the amount of non-player characters that are in view.
Yeah, for sure.
This is true.
But
yeah,
those can be pretty good CPU stress tests.
This is an interesting thing. In a game like Hitman, those aren't just like animations; those are real living AI that are doing something. But in other games that have just like background animations that they're not really AI, like Tom's example right now with like Street Fighter. In those cases, it's an interesting limitation where it talks a little bit about how their engine works, where skinning was historically done on the CPU. Skinning is the transformation of like vertices to like have smooth movements, and also so that animations are not done by like blocks of moving geometry, but rather things that are bending. And the skinning was historically done on the CPU, but there's ways to do it on the GPU, and it was like an optimization for a long time was moving that over to the GPU. I don't know how common it is these days. I think it is, but it kind of speaks to how the engine works if they're cutting animations at a distance for non-AI characters, actually.
Yep, fair enough. Okay, let's move on to the next question. This one from Monad with a View.
I like it.
I'd love to know the thinking behind entering that as your alias, but do any members of the team ever find themselves absent-mindedly assessing the rendering features of reality itself? And I can answer that fairly straight. No, I don't. But Alex, I've seen some of your tweets, Alex. You do.
Yeah, I do it all the time. I'm fascinated by this stuff. Not from the lens of I think reality is like a matrix simulation or something like that, but from the lens of just kind of being fascinated by light play in general. I think certain things, you can find yourself being surprised at times. Like you like see light hit off a piece of like old metal and you're like, wait a minute, what the heck? It's producing this weird pattern on the wall. And then you're like, oh, I didn't really expect that. Or like light bounces off something and it like chromatically disperses and you're like, whoa, like car paint, for example, like that's really cool. I love that kind of stuff, just seeing it in person. And then after the fact, imagining how it would either be faked in a game or actually be simulated. And that's just fun stuff to think about. Yeah, for sure.
So Tom, how are the cascaded shadow maps in your room there?
They're very good, thank you. I mean, they're very subtly blended.
Have you been absent-mindedly assessing the rendering features of reality at any point?
In Brighton, yes, several times. I think when you get your face so close to, your eyes on a subject like ours on a daily basis, your mind is always geared towards how good certain things look and how realistic they are. So it's certainly natural, but I think it's interesting sometimes to see, like you say, Alex, phenomena in like rare phenomena where you see like a shadow hitting something in a certain way or reflections, and you think, well, I would criticize it in a game in a weird way because it'd be like, oh, that's a little bit weird. Like this sort of lighting doesn't usually fall this way on a reflection, and then I rarely see this.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it's I think I've often occasionally looked at like a shadow from a tree and it's like really diffuse on the floor and I just say, that's very low resolution there. We should have bumped that up. Very disappointing.
Well, I'm actually going to sort of retract my answer slightly. When I look at shadows in real life, I think to myself, medium shadow quality in PC games isn't actually that bad.
Yeah, that is another thing. Like when you look at real life and think about video game graphics, one thing that happened when ray tracing came about is a lot of people were saying that ray tracing is making too many reflections everywhere or something like that. And that was a common thing seeing under the videos. But I kid you not, go outside or just look at any object in your room, even matte ones, oh my God, you'd be surprised at how many reflections there are there, like visible ones that are pretty coherent. You'd be really shocked. So like, that's one thing that I saw that when those videos came out. And before you start criticizing video game graphics, it always helps to take a look outside the window and think about like the way light works. So yes, I always do think about graphics when I look.
Well, you could also take a look in the mirror, because
Yeah.
in the last generation, there are basically very
None.
few mirrors that actually worked, to the point where
Yeah,
there's a
my
Twitter
God.
account that's do the mirrors in this game work,
Oh, they're great. Yeah.
and there's not many. Next question, this one from Sloth. Can developers significantly modify how ray tracing works to create unusual lighting effects that diverge from the way real light behaves, or are their options more limited by current hardware and graphics engines? For example, is it possible for a new game to have lighting where the rays move in unusual patterns to create the kind of surreal environments we saw in Soul Reaver, Shadow Man, Antichamber, Alice, etc., but using ray tracing to create effects beyond what was possible in those games? Well, fundamentally, it's maths, right, Alex? And you can adjust the maths however you like.
Yeah, for the most part, I think one thing that I'm not completely certain about is about like ray generation and like casting, which is handled by the hardware, where it will mostly go in like based upon the ray will go in a certain direction based upon like the material parameters and all these things that are programmatically set up. But like when it's going through there in the hardware and being accelerated, it is a bit of a black box, even on consoles there. Like you can't really be messing with that. That's the whole purpose of it being hardware accelerated. But with that being said, like anything, if you've seen trippy effects in movies before, they're using ray tracing in movies usually these days. So yes, of course, there's nothing getting in the way with that. And a really cool example of that is, I don't know if there's been many games that have done it, but one thing rasterized games that are actually really limited in is the ability to mess with the FOV, the field of view, and do weird things with that. Rasterized games just kind of like, there's like ways to like distort the camera, but that's really about it. And like zooming in and out in terms of like how wide it is, but you can't do much more of that. But with ray tracing, the things, if you're doing like the primary view is done via ray tracing, which no games have done yet other than path trace ones, you can actually do extremely trippy views and fisheye lenses that you cannot do in a rasterized game. And there are even like ports of Quake that do that, I'm pretty sure. So there are some really cool effects that are limited to ray tracing, actually, for making games look trippier, including like undulating geometry and stuff that you really couldn't do. Or something that's really hard to do in rasterized games is any sort of mirror effects and at all, just any in general. And there was a really good presentation by the developers of Psychonauts 2 on how they had to do portals, for example, which took a lot of research and so many workarounds that almost barely work. But with ray tracing, it's actually really straightforward, and you could also make it even trippier than what they do there. So yeah, ray tracing is excellent for that kind of stuff.
I think looking at some Soul Reaver footage right now, like reminding myself of that game in particular, which was noted in the question, this game is actually very interesting for like having some really bizarre stuff, like light coming through the ceiling, which is like watery. So you get like this sort of very refracted look, and it all casts across the floor. Even on the old versions, the PlayStation and PC versions, there was this refracted light like hitting everything in the scene, and mist as well. Obviously a technical limitation at the time to hide LOD pop-in, but it was actually kind of adding to the atmosphere of that game. And you can do a lot these days with light hitting mist and as well as the water stuff. So yeah, I'd love to see an update on that game with some interesting ray tracing techniques there.
Okay, good stuff. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Mr. Burns, one of my personal favourite fictional characters, alongside Doctor Doom and Palpatine. Let's go. Bad frame pacing is usually associated with games capped at 30 FPS on a 60 Hz output. Does this issue also occur with 60F games that are run on a 120 Hz output, i.e. Series X and S? If yes, does it happen regularly? And should the refresh rate rather be set to 60 Hz as default and 120 Hz only be manually activated for 120 FPS games. So, Alex, there is a classic example of this.
Yeah, unfortunately it's our whipping boy. It's Halo Infinite, which has really bad frame pacing when you do 60 FPS in 120 Hz container, like really, really bad, like Bloodborne almost. And that is a bad one. I think there are other titles that people wrote about in the comments afterwards where they might have noticed it. It might have been like something like DMC5, maybe, like Devil May Cry 5, maybe an example of that, I believe, and maybe some other things. This is going to be primarily an Xbox thing because 120 Hertz is explicit on PlayStation 5, as far as I know. It requires the developer to kind of support it. It cannot be forced from a menu and then just applied to all games, you know, just without them knowing. On Xbox, though, and of course on PC, you can apply that to any game, really, and see what happens. I think usually there's like not an issue on Xbox, like they just like double pack the signal or something like that, and you know, like the way that the frames are buffered, then you get like decreased latency and things like that. But I don't think it's usually an issue there. So the way you phrase this question is really Xbox specific, and I don't think they can really do anything about it. This is more of a developer thing. And if you want to, you can just manually activate and deactivate 60, 120 Hertz, whatever, from the settings dashboard really easily. Well, even while you're in the game, you don't need to restart the game. So, okay. Which is not the same on PlayStation 5. Usually you have to restart games there if you like edit that option.
Well, this is an interesting scenario because it's absolutely conceivable that a gamer would just have their console set to 120 Hertz all the time. But when it comes to us analyzing a game, typically we start at 60 Hertz because then we get full resolution capture on our capture devices. And if we go to 120, we've got to drop down to like 1440p or even 1080p on a PlayStation 5. So yes, that's actually quite an interesting thing, that there may well be scenarios where some games that are capped at 60 do so with like 8.3 millisecond fluctuations up or down above 16.7. And that's not right. And in the case of Halo Infinite, it does look bad. And in the case of Halo Infinite, if you set to 60 Hertz, you get 60 Hertz as it should be. But there might potentially be an input latency hit there, but who knows? But yeah, interesting question there. Maybe we should take a look at some of these other titles that were mentioned, but typically it's not really an issue because John would notice it because he is set to 120 most of the time. Okay, next question from Mr. Ratchet. Console showdown! ! Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo? Which is your favorite console back then, and has your opinion changed now? Tom?
The answer is pretty clear cut for me in that it was Mega Drive Genesis back in the day, being the first console I owned, and a fantastic console it was. Sonic, Light Crusader, Micro Machines, just incredible console, and did so many great things. But in later years, I think Super Nintendo's won a lot of my favor because of the fact it has so many great RPGs, JRPGs, Final Fantasy 6 and stuff like that, Chrono Trigger. So it's kind of tilted a little bit that way. But on hindsight, I still love the Sonic games. Like those are Sonic 1, 2, 3, and Knuckles are still such classics, as kind of proven recently by their Origins repackaging. So yeah, I think it's been a bit. Yeah, it's very much like a slight change since then, but I do appreciate them both. These days, Super Nintendo, though.
So have you got any skin in this game, or do you just not care?
I think it's obviously Sega Genesis and or the Mega Drive, because one of these devices has Shining Force and Shining Force 2, and one of them doesn't. So, yeah.
Okay,
but to be serious about it, I actually prefer the pad.
Right.
Like the
Yeah,
Genesis
I agree.
pad.
Mm-hmm.
And I also, people dunk on it all the time, but I love the way the Genesis sounds. I just love the way it sounds. It sounds it's kind of got that weird AC beat to it that sounds really electronic, and it's satisfying, and I like the way that sounds usually. And technically, obviously, there's like the color palette stuff, which some people don't like, but it was, had like a faster CPU, and that showed in the games with, could you have less slowdown, for example, in ports and stuff. So that's pretty important.
Interesting, because obviously when I first started work, the Mega Drive was kind of like the key system, and then a few months later we got the Super Nintendo, the Super Famicom imported from Japan, and we had F-Zero, Super Mario World, and it was like a whole new experience, right? It was doing things, both of those titles were doing things that we'd never seen before on the Mega Drive, and it was at that point we thought, wow, this is toast. Nintendo has won. I think there's a few things there which have basically tempered that over time, which is essentially that the catalogue of games on both systems is so diverse, so different, that it does come down to a software choice rather than a hardware choice. I think it tips the balance, whereas these days it's very rare. I mean, it's basically the platform exclusives that are exclusive. Multi-platform was far less of an issue back in the day. So, they're almost, from my perspective, viewed as two different systems almost, simply because of the diversity in the catalogue. But yeah, I think possibly because of my own personal association with Sega across the years, it would be the Mega Drive / Genesis. But man, the Super Nintendo had some amazing titles.
It's a tough pick, isn't it? And to go to that point, Aladdin. You remember the Aladdin? It just shows how different approaches for different consoles produce such incredible results on both sides, but involved a very specific approach to making it happen. Yeah,
absolutely.
I definitely miss that about that generation, like how wildly different games you'd get out of both systems.
Okay, so we're going to finish off this supporter Q&A. I'm going to be away for 2 weeks. John is already on vacation and will be returning pretty much the same time I will at the end of the month. So I guess we can both be missing 2 further DF Directs, but the supporters have got wind of this and have got some questions in for me before I go. First one from Ang ETF. Hello, DDF cast. Here's a question for Rich. You're teasing us with the idea of overclocking a PS triple for a video, but what would be the point? Without spoiling any hashtag content, can you say a little bit more of what could potentially be achieved? What's the point with a lot of my content? It's interesting, right? It's entertainment. It's intriguing. And the concept of overclocking the triple, really straightforward. Performance was a genuine issue with, I'd say, both Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in that particular generation. And maybe, adding a bit of GPU power could have overcome some of the difficulties that we saw in that particular generation. Maybe it could have made some of the Xbox 360 comparisons a bit more favorable. But ultimately, I want to overclock the PS3 because I think it's quite interesting. I'd like to see what happens. That's it, really. Let's move on to the next question. This one's quite amusing, from Kevin Dixon. Hey DFers, I noticed that Rich has a novel cooling solution set up for his Switch in that it's stored safely atop a radiator. Is this the recommended location for all my gaming hardware? You can see it over there.
Yeah.
The Switch is indeed on top of a radiator. But I don't think Kevin is kind of seeing the wood for the trees here. What he's failed to notice is that all of my gaming hardware is right in front of a radiator.
Yes.
Which isn't particularly recommended. But in mitigation, the radiator is never on. It's not on at all because I don't need it to. I mean, all of us have got like high power PCs which effectively heat the room in the depths of winter.
They do, my goodness.
So the radiator is there for heating when you've not got a whole series of high power equipment in a confined space. And you may also note that above the radiator is a window which can be opened for extra cooling prowess. But the concept of a radiator that isn't on, I mean, potentially it could be repurposed as a heatsink.
Yeah, why not?
But yes, that's the answer for that one. Final question I'll bring you guys in for this one from 1040 STF. So, Rich, you're taking some hot vacations next week. That does obviously mean Microsoft is going to announce some new studio acquisitions on Monday or Tuesday, as usual when you leave. This is a fact. This is the rule. The rule. This ain't rumor. Science has spoken. Happy holidays. He's not wrong, is he? Basically, whenever I don't go on holiday very often, and when I do, something happens. The last time I was driving up to Norfolk and stopped off, and turned out that Microsoft had announced the acquisition of Activision. And so it's kind of like getting straight on Slack to say, look, just do a DF direct and I'll go about my business. But yes, I have to admit, part of the reason I've chosen this time for vacation is I'm not expecting anything to happen. But, maybe I'll be surprised. Alex, any thoughts on what might possibly happen at the I actually go on vacation?
Oh, gosh. Ada Lovelace GPUs are... There's a secret thing that happens. You're gone for 2 weeks?
2 weeks, yeah. That's quite a wide window.
It's a danger. Because that's a rumor. What is another one? Sony acquisitions are probably more probable at this point, not Microsoft.
Good point. Yeah,
they've already spent on Bungie. Surely that's all they'll do.
No,
you'd hope that
Sony buy Nintendo.
I'm sort of going on the theory here that the likes of Jim Ryan and Phil Spencer might want to take some vacations of their own.
Yeah, right.
It's not beyond the realms of possibility. So hopefully that will coincide with my vacation. I guess possibly the second GPU in the power supply of the PlayStation 5 could be revealed. But beyond that, I'm hoping that it's going to be a quiet and uneventful time, and I can return fully refreshed in a Battaglia style. But that's it. That's it for DF Direct number 69. And
we haven't done it. Nice.
It's over. If you enjoyed it, please do like, subscribe, share the content, ring the bell for those notionally instant notifications. No guarantees, of course, that there will actually be any notifications. That is my disclaimer. A DF supporter program. Get involved. Join our amazing community. See our amazing early access stuff. Bonus materials. There's a ton going on there. I do highly recommend it, obviously. But that's all from us for now. There'll be another lineup this week because both John and I are missing, so I'm going to be curious to see what that is, but only upon my return.
Roping in for this one.
I'm on DF Detox for the following 2 weeks, so yes. But yeah, I was going to say see you next week, but I'll see you in 3, but there'll be a new episode next week.
I'll see you next week. There.
Will you? I hope not.
Yeah.
Oh, Alex will. Okay.
I will.
Alex will.
Not you. You and the audience, you.
Yeah.
Alex is coming with you on holiday, Rich. We didn't tell you, but this is happening now.
Back up. Yeah.
Well, that would be quite an intriguing experience.
I'll be a dark passenger on that flight.
Anyway, that's all from all of us for now. Thanks for watching.